you for coming. Donc, so we will do this. We will do this seminar in English. So you have to accept my English first. Thank you for coming. So we are very, very pleased to host Patrick Devine-Wright and Tara Quinn for this seminar from the Nature, Sciences et Société seminar, this special event. It's a pleasure and thank you, Patrick, for coming to Montpellier, while Patrick was in Paris and he came to Montpellier to visit us. And thank you, Tara, also for this presentation. Tara is working in a research project, and she's staying in Montpellier for a couple of weeks. But Raphael will introduce Tara after. So we have this seminar on place attachment and different development on place attachment on different case studies. This seminar comes after the presentation of Chris Raymond and Raphael and I I think it was in March, a seminar where we tried to develop ideas about place attachment. This is embedded into a research project from the Belmont Forum named MAGIC, which is about adaptive management and transfer of vulnerability in coastal areas, where we started to interact with peculiarly the University of Exeter, where Tara is working. And we start developing ideas about place attachment and empirical work and work on theories and so on. So it's a continuous development. And we think that for the community of Montpellier, it resonates well with all these ideas about territoire, about relationship to place. So it's a good debate to have. So for this morning, we will have two presentations. We will start with Patrick. Patrick is a professor at the University of Exeter. He holds the chair of human geography. He has been working for many years on these ideas of place attachment, environmental identity, and it's a good opportunity for him to introduce work about this. There is also a growing field all over the world, internationally, on environmental psychology mixed with human geography. So it's a new field emerging, which in France is not well known. So it's an opportunity to discuss about that. And Patrick has written, as you can expect, many papers and books about place attachment and identity. On the presentation of this seminar, you have links for this. And so thank you again, Patrick, for coming. And it's my pleasure to give the floor to Patrick.
Can you hear me all right then? Is this microphone working good? Okay. Well, thank you for the invitation and thank you for coming on a wet morning in Montpellier. I apologize that my French is not good enough to speak to you in your own language, but I will try and be clear and not too fast in speaking. I have to say that I'm originally from Dublin in Ireland, so my conversation is probably very quick in English, but I will try to be a bit calm this morning. As Francois already pointed out, it is important to understand that although I'm currently a professor in geography, my education has been in psychology and social psychology and environmental psychology. So I have crossed disciplinary boundaries, but that affects my perspective on the subjects that I research. The other thing to say at the start is that I have always been interested in place attachment and place identity. The first journal paper that I wrote 20 years ago was on that topic. But the last 10 years, my research has been about conflict in land use conflict, spatial conflict, over the siting of energy infrastructure. And it will be about the concept which is very commonly used in England, maybe in the United States, which is called the NIMBY concept. Now, maybe it is less common here, but I also talk about what that concept means as a way of understanding siting issues. So if you are interested in conflicts over the siting of high-speed rail or transport infrastructure, maybe there is something in common with this topic as well. As Francois has mentioned, I have published some papers on this already. The two pieces of research I will talk about today are studies that have been published in the last 12 months, so they are quite recent. I will not talk about earlier work very much, but I'm very happy to answer questions if you have any. So, in summary of my talk, I will just begin with what we call the low-carbon transition, which is the response to climate change to build more renewable energy technologies, at least. Obviously, in this country, it is a little bit different because you use nuclear power so much in your energy system for electricity production. In the UK, not so much. And in England, at least from the beginning, the attempt to have more renewable energy has been very controversial. And the main problem is that if you ask people if they want more renewable energy, they always say yes. But if you want to build a wind farm or another facility, communities often say no. So the main issue for the research has been to try and understand this problem and distinction between the general support and the local opposition, local objection. So I will talk about the NIMBY concept a bit and the way in which I have tried to overcome some of the problems and the weaknesses with the NIMBY explanation by using the concept of place attachment, which we have mentioned already, and then I will talk about two empirical studies before making conclusions. So just to start very briefly with this issue of energy transitions, and this is caused by the need to mitigate climate change, and that involves taking fossil fuels out of the energy system, which in the UK is coal and gas for electricity production and heat production, and the construction of renewable energy projects and other low-carbon projects. And it is impossible, I think, to consider that this transition will happen successfully if there is not public consent for this process. So social acceptance is very important, and as the policymakers know and the industry know, a lack of acceptability can lead to these kinds of scenes where you have public protest and objections and delays and conflict really over whether these projects can go forward. Now, over the last 10 years, the concept of acceptability and social acceptability has become very commonly talked about in the social science literature. But really, it is a little bit of a confusing term because most of the research is actually about objection. It's not about support. It's not about acceptability at all. There is very little research done on acceptance of energy research. The topic is called acceptance, but really people are researching opposition or objection. And the words that you use to understand acceptability are important. There is some data from a questionnaire with people in the UK, and you can see that they do not interpret acceptance and support as being the same. Many people do, but there are 97 people who think that this is a high voltage power line, they think it is acceptable, but they do not support it. So you have to be quite careful about how you operationalize these concepts when you do the research, but you also have to think carefully as a social scientist about what is the value of the research you're doing. So do you enable a transition which is acceptable, or do you enable a transition where the public actually gives support, active support? And that raises a lot of really big questions about how you achieve the low-carbon transition and what is the social model that you try and use. Do you try and encourage communities to deliberate about low-carbon energy in their local area and maybe do more a citizen-led process where people actively support it, perhaps? Or do you think about the transition being led by multinational companies, very big infrastructure projects, and your aim is simply to hope that people will tolerate or accept it in the area without objecting? So these questions emerge, I think, for what social scientists are trying to achieve and prove. Anyway, the NIMBY concept is the most common way in the UK to understand the distinction between general public support for renewable energy and community objections. And it is not a new name, it's not a new label, it has been around for several decades, and it originated in the United States about unwelcome development in the local area where you live. And it is many things. It is a label, and it is a pejorative label. It is not a compliment to call somebody a NIMBY, very typically, but it is also a discourse about space. It is an assumption about proximity. The people who are objecting are the people who live closest to the site, the place. And it is also an explanation, because you assume lots of characteristics of the people who are doing the objecting. And the studies show that here, the pejorative label comes from the deficits that these people hold. They do not know the facts or the truth. They are ignorant. They are not rational enough or objective enough. They are too emotional. They're difficult to talk to have a rational argument with. And because of that, what they say is not very legitimate, so we don't really need to listen to these people. And also, they are really just selfish. They are only acting for their own personal gain. Maybe they're concerned mostly about their property values. They're not interested in the public view or the public realm or the national good. That is the stereotype of the NIMBY objector. And for that reason, social scientists have said that it is not appropriate to think about this kind of issue through the NIMBY lens. Maybe you study it, but you do not make these assumptions about the objectors because they are not appropriate without empirical support. So, as I've said, many social scientists have critiqued the NIMBY concept, which raises the question, well, how do we understand spatial conflict then? How do we understand the causes of people's objections? And here I will just say something about two pathways I can observe in the literature. The first is to investigate how the NIMBY concept is used as a social construction. So it is an idea, at least. Who uses it? How do they talk about it? What impact does it have? The second strand, which I am mainly involved in, is looking for maybe a better explanation with more empirical support for public community objections. And that is where I think, in some ways, the concept of place and attachment can play a useful role. So here is a framework that Gordon Walker and other colleagues on a project I was involved with a few years ago, we proposed to understand public engagement with energy infrastructure in these contexts of conflict. And the important point to note about this is that we call public engagement a process which has two directions. On the left-hand side, we have engagement with the public by industry, by companies, by municipalities, government actors. On the right-hand side, we have the communities, the members of the public who are engaging with the technology projects. And so public engagement is both of these things. It is engagement by the public, it is engagement with the public. And then what we observe, which is conflict or support or whatever, is in the middle. It is the interactions between these different actors in a particular place or context. Now, the interesting thing about this framework is that it says that the causes of objection may not be over here, okay? So the NIMBY stereotype says that if we have a conflict, it is because the objectors are ignorant. The objectors are too emotional. The objectors are too selfish. So the causes are over here. But if you have a framework like this, then at least you make the assumption that part of the cause of conflict is to do with the expectations of the public, which are held by industry, and also how they do engagement. What kind of methods do they use? When do they choose to engage? How much do they listen or involve local people in the process of creating new energy infrastructure? The final thing I would say about this is that the NIMBY concept as a social construction is an idea. So it is definitely found here. That's what the research shows. If you talk to people in companies about building energy projects or infrastructure projects, they will soon start talking about the NIMBY problem, at least in the UK anyway. So they have expectations of the public that the public will oppose, that you have at least a small number of people who are very difficult to deal with and who you must always be prepared to work with or work against because they may cause a big problem for your project. But of course, NIMBYism is also over here. If you have a discussion on the street or at a bus stop in the UK, people will understand the NIMBY concept. It is an everyday part of everyday discourse. So it also affects how communities think about their own objection or other people's objections. They are aware of the stereotype and they must negotiate how they present themselves to the public in order to prevent themselves maybe being described as NIMBYs, because if they do get described as NIMBYs, then they do not have any more influence on the debate because they are considered to be illegitimate, etc. So the framework looks at the NIMBY concept in a more socially constructed way with the dynamics between different actors in this way. And the point I made in a paper a few years ago was that if you see NIMBYism like this, then it is both a cause and a consequence of conflicts. Because if you see conflict and you interpret it as a company or whatever as NIMBYism, then you do things differently. And I will talk about this in a minute. You design your engagement with communities in a different way because you expect hostility. But that, of course, itself can make people feel that they are not being listened to, they are not being included, they're not being recognized, which can make people angry and objecting. So it causes the thing to be a self-fulfilling prophecy, which is a real problem that we need to try and overcome. So the researchers looked at the consequences of the NIMBY discourse, and they have found many different things. I mean, from the start, you could say that it is a way of thinking about space as a backyard. It is a way of thinking about the environment, which influences how people think. It certainly has had some impact on the trajectory or the pathways of energy, low carbon energy. So in the UK at least, there is a lot of support for building wind farms in the sea, because at least some of the presumption that they will not be controversial socially because there is no backyard to affect. That, of course, is not true. It is still controversial to build wind turbines in the sea as well. We know that from research. It influences design because the designers of the technology think, well, how can we minimize the hostility or the objections? And so there is some examples of the way in which infrastructure is designed to accommodate the imagination of what the public will like or will not like. It also affects the methods. So we were told in our research that a public meeting like this is no longer used by energy companies in the UK because it is too easy for this kind of public meeting to be hijacked by the objectors who stand at the back and they shout and they get angry, and then the people from the company cannot control that situation. So they do not do that anymore as a method of engagement. Instead, they have what we call exhibitions, which are a small room, a small number of people, a map, a picture, and you make sure that you do not ever have a big gathering so that it is more easy to keep it civil and peaceful. And the other thing which is important is that the policymakers have been very supportive of new interventions to prevent the conflict, they think at least. And in the UK, that is about making sure that there are benefit payments to the communities who live near the infrastructure to be sited. And you can see this as being, well, it is an instrumental act to try and create social acceptability based on the assumption that if people are selfish, then you need to give them an incentive to accept the change. And this has been criticized by social scientists because it is not enough about justice, but it is too much about instrumentality of getting people to accept it. And of course, the research shows that if people think that they are being bribed, it will make them more hostile to the project. So it is not necessarily a solution. And as I mentioned, the NIMBY concept also is present in the beliefs that the members of the residents' communities have about objecting. In our research, we find that they use the same word to describe the local area, the backyard, the back garden. It is their way of imagining the space. And they also have to use discursive strategies to represent themselves to avoid the worst of the NIMBY label, maybe by saying that everybody is like a NIMBY because no one wants to live beside this infrastructure, etc. So they have strategies to try and cope with that. But I also said that there were many studies that are trying to find a better explanation for the objections themselves. And across many studies, there are many case studies now of renewable energy projects, of wind energy, etc. They show that there are certain factors that come up again and again and again across these different cases. And I list them here. There are 4. One is about trust, and particularly a lack of trust in the development company or in the decision-making process in the municipality or the politicians who are making the decisions about whether the planning should be accepted or not, a lack of trust. Secondly, there is the problem of distributional justice, which is where local people feel that they are getting all of the impacts and none of the benefits of a project. Thirdly, there is concerns about the fairness of the procedure of decision-making and the consultation process to do with information provision, etc. And then finally, there is this explanation which is about the place, about the environment, and about people's feelings about the environment and how that is influential in explaining their responses to proposals for change. The important thing about these factors is that they are different every time you have a new project, because the interactions between the actors are never exactly the same. So it is difficult to predict which ones of these will be important in a given project in the future. And from our research, we know that there are situations where if you look at the distributional justice, there does not seem to be much benefit for local people, or if you look at procedures, there do not seem to be very many efforts to engage people, and yet sometimes there is support for projects. So you cannot be too predictable about exactly how important each of these are. They will vary, but that means that you do need to think about these projects according to their context, and I think the concept of place is one way to help you to do that. So what does it mean? And Francois, we were discussing it in the car. Maybe it's a little bit like territoire, but I think it's maybe a little bit different as well, because it is not linked to an administrative unit necessarily. It may be, but it may not be as well. So here is a quote from an American humanities researcher, art scholar. I will not read it out, but you can see it, and it tries to come across the complexity of the nature of the relationship between a person and a particular location. It is temporal and spatial and personal and political, so it has many, many layers in the past, the present, and the future, and in different dimensions. So one of the nice things about place, like many other social science concepts like community, is that it is quite simple in some ways, but quite complicated in many others. It is not owned by any one discipline. If you are interested in place, you must read geography, but you must also read psychology, you must also read sociology and architecture. So this makes it, again, more complicated, because each of the disciplines has its own perspective or multiple perspectives and different methods. But they all agree on one thing, which is that if you are interested in place, then you look at social relations in a different way. My PhD was in social psychology, and if you look at this social psychology perspective on social relations, there really is no environment. They are just interested in the relationships between individuals or actors, and the environment is completely absent from the perspective. So from a place perspective, that is different from the beginning. You make the assumption, at least from the start, that it is more than just a container or a backdrop on a theater stage. It is actually an actor in itself. It's an important part of the problem, not just the background. And so Cresswell, for example, talks about an ontology of place. It is a way of seeing the world. You see the world in terms of different places, not just different problems or different processes. You have a place-based perspective. And people have said that this is also a challenge to a Cartesian mentality, which often separates the society from the environment. The concept of place at least tries to blur the boundaries between people and environment, between society and nature. Geographers have said that there are 3 dimensions to place. One is the physical location. The second is the social milieu, the locale for social relations. And the third is this idea of sense of place, which originated in the 1970s with the humanist geographers. And this is about the emotional connection to a particularly important place for you. And across different disciplines, the word sense of place is interpreted in different ways. Environmental psychology talk about place attachment and place identity. Architects talk about genius loci. So there are different words to describe, I think, maybe the same thing. The other important thing to say about place is that there is no assumption about spatial scale. So this room is a place, Montpellier is a place, France is a place, the Earth is a place. They are all different kinds of places. It does not make any assumption about spatial scale. And the geographers also talk about the relational approach to place, which is to say that you cannot understand Montpellier without understanding connections between Montpellier and Paris or other places like Nice or whatever. You must not see them as being bounded in some ways. But when I think about sense of place, I'm influenced by the work of an American geographer called Daniel Williams. And he said that there were two dimensions to place. One is the symbolic meanings, and the second one are these emotional bonds. And I will use these to illustrate the rest of my talk in the empirical work. Here is maybe another way of illustrating this. So for me, you cannot have a place without the meanings. So if we think about Montpellier, you immediately have some ideas about what is it like as a place, what are the people like who live there, what is its culture like. You always have some meanings, and these meanings are contested and they change, but you have some meanings. It's not empty. That is the difference between a space and a place in geography literature. But you also have the attachment bonds on the left, so these are also interacting. And these are these processes of emotional connection or not that bind or weave together these people and the environment, the group and the environment. The definition here is from a book from 1992 saying that place attachments are typically positive and they sometimes occur without the awareness of the people who have them. So often the literature says that we only become really clear about these place attachment bonds when there is a circumstance of change. Maybe you have to relocate where you are living to another place, and then you realize that actually you feel a sense of grief or loss. Or maybe there is a proposal to do something different in your place, to change it. If there are new people coming in or a new infrastructure being built, then you think, oh, actually, this is going to change the place that I like or that I feel attached to. So there are these two different dimensions, and I will talk about both of them in my empirical work. The context, as I mentioned already, is about the citing of infrastructure that is not very positively seen in society. In this study in particular, it was the electricity grid, the transmission power lines. So even less than wind farms, these are typically things that in the UK and many other countries people do not want to live close to. They're often concerned about the health impacts from the electromagnetic radiation. They're concerned about the impacts it might have in lots of ways. So it is a difficult thing to build this kind of infrastructure, and this particular project was funded by the Norwegian Research Council after there was a controversy in Norway that nearly led to a change of government because the grid company wanted to build a power line across a fjord in the west of the country, and there was a big debate then about whether the landscape in that place should contain high voltage power lines or should not, and whether it was acceptable or appropriate to put that kind of infrastructure in that kind of place. So in this project, it was a collaboration between Norwegian and UK scholars, and we collected data in the Norway and in UK using many methods. And here I will just focus on two of the pieces of work that we did in the UK using qualitative methods of focus groups and interviews. And these focus on each side of that model, the place meanings and the people, the emotional bonds. So here is a little graphic of the United Kingdom, and the areas where we chose as case studies were areas where new power lines were being proposed, for different reasons though. In the one below, which is near where we are based in Exeter, the reason was the construction of a new nuclear power station called Hinkley Point C. And because the power station was so big, they needed to build new power lines to connect the power line to the grid. And this was across a rural part of England called Somerset. And in Mid Wales, the middle one on the left-hand side, this was again another power line being constructed because of building new renewable energy projects like wind farms in this area and transporting the electricity into the grid for the national system and the national benefit. So the first piece of research I want to talk to you about is about this idea of the meanings associated with places. And this comes from a lot of research which has shown that the way in which people construct the landscape or place and the contrast they make with the energy project is very important to explain the conflict. So here are just two quotations. One is from a local resident in a study that I did about an offshore wind farm. The second one is from a writer in Ireland talking about his reasons for objecting. But what I want you to identify here is the way in which there is a binary categorization made between the conflict between an industry, a technology which is industrial in nature, and then we have a rural or a marine context which is seen as being very natural. And these two are contrasted with each other to say that it is not appropriate to mix these two together. So it's a way of constructing both the environment and the infrastructure as being incompatible with each other. So in this research, we interpreted this in relation to a pre-existing concept in social psychology and other disciplines, which is called essentialisation. And essentialisation is a process which tries to argue that a given entity or a thing has got an unchangeable essence. It is very particular, and it is just the way things are. And sometimes people construct identities in this way. And of course, geographers have been sometimes critical of attempts to say that the identity of a place is fixed or the identity of a place is single rather than plural. But nevertheless, showing this process in relation to energy conflicts was something that has not been done before. So what we do here is we look at the discourse of the residents themselves through the focus group discussions which are held in these two different areas, and we are asking them about what they think the impacts of the power line will be on the local area, and listening to see whether they talk about it in a way which reveals essentialisation. So we found many examples where people's discourse clearly showed that they regarded the countryside near where they live and the power line as being two completely different things that cannot be mixed together. So the language is about imposing a technology on a landscape rather than it growing out of it organically. And there is also an assumption that about the visitors. So this is a place where people come to enjoy the countryside. The countryside is imagined here as a place which must be different from the city. We have an assumption about a healthy rural context which is different from an urban context which is full of pollution and stress. And therefore, if you put the industrial pylons in this place, you take away some of its essence of being this natural oasis which is different. You mix things up too much. And in the UK, our planning institutions are founded for the last 100 years on a distinction between the country and the city, and to preserve the countryside as a place where people from the city can visit and be exposed to nature. And what they're saying is that this cultural assumption is violated by placing industrial technology like power lines into this context. And they were very clear about the impact of this. It is a very visceral, emotional reaction. It's a little bit like some of the work of Mary Douglas, where she talks about dirt and the feelings people have when you mix up things that shouldn't be mixed together. And you can see people using very extreme emotional language here to describe it as horrendous and disgusting and evil, that you shouldn't really be doing this. So it's a falling back on a very general categorization as being impossible to bring together. So that is maybe what we expected from the literature, which is that one of the ways people say no to these infrastructures is to say that they are out of place, they are inappropriate in this context. But when we listened more closely to the residents in the focus groups, we found that they were maybe more clever than that as well, because they didn't just say the countryside is not appropriate for the technology. They said that their countryside was even more inappropriate for the technology than other countrysides. So they distinguished between different rural places. So here we have some quotations where they talk about the local area, and they talk about it as being very rural, not just rural, but very rural. We are the greenest country. It's not just green, but we are more green than the rest of the green. None of the other green areas are as nice as our area. So there is an attempt in the discourse to say that we are even more distinctive. Our place is unique. We are not just normal countryside, we are very special countryside. And so it is even more inappropriate to put the technology in this place. And they imagine other kinds of countryside, which is flat, maybe rather than with hills, and where there is maybe already infrastructure, like a railway line, so maybe it's not as beautiful as a place like theirs, and it would be less obtrusive then. So we have attempts to strategically construct the local area as being different from other rural places, so there is another layer of argument against the citing of the technology in that place. There is another reason why you cannot mix the two things together, because it's not appropriate. But even though some people said that, it was also clear that other people regarded that as being an argument that was not really very strong. So we also have what we call de-essentialisation taking place amongst some of the local residents too, who recognize that the attempt to argue that their countryside is this pristine, beautiful, natural environment is a romantic idea. And if you look at what actually happens in this local area beside this town, it is an industrial place. It is full of tractors. This is the mechanism of agriculture. It is working 365 days a year, sometimes at night. It is not the countryside of the imagination. The countryside of the reality is very different. It is a place where people work the land, and it is industrial in its own way. And if you take this perspective, you are not concerned about the infrastructure. It's not going to change anything. There's already industry there. So what is the problem? So we see a variety of perspectives when we listen to local people. Yes, it is talking about the different essences, and yes, it is talking about the uniqueness of the local place, but also we see some diversity as well. And it makes for some interesting discussions, I think, about whether you can construct low carbon energy as being maybe more normal in a rural area, for example. And there are some studies maybe of wave energy which show that when people think about the technology, they also think about natural processes. So maybe it is less out of place in a natural environment, maybe. So just to summarize this bit of work, the meanings of the landscape are not fixed, they're not singular, they are plural in many ways, but they're also a cultural phenomenon in the UK. They are enshrined in our literature and in our planning institutions. And they are used as a strategic resource by the residents who are opposing the projects to say why it is not appropriate to put this technology in this place, but to put it elsewhere. And it relies on the dualistic binaries between nature and industry, or nature and technology, between the city and the countryside, between health and between maybe illness or contagion, which makes it not compatible to do this, or part of the argumentation anyway. And as I said, maybe the thing to do in future research is to examine ways that the de-essentialisation can be done in such a way to enable low carbon energy to be constructed. If you believe that we need more renewable energy, then you must think at least about ways of countering these arguments and thinking about maybe hybridity or de-essentialisation in terms of ways in which the industry can be seen as being less industrial or more natural, etc., as a way of getting around these kind of conflicts, which tend to recur again and again and again, at least if you have large-scale energy projects being constructed. So that's the first piece of empirical work. Now I will talk about the place attachment bonds. Now these are the connection between the person and the environment, which is special. And the first thing I wanted to say is that there is quite a lot of confusion in the literature on social acceptability about how the relationship is between place attachment and social acceptance. So in the first studies that were done with this, there was always a negative relationship. The people who opposed the projects were the people who were most strongly attached to the place. So it makes it look as if being strongly attached is something about being an opponent of change. But I did some research a few years ago with a tidal energy project in Northern Ireland, and it was very clear that the people who were most strongly attached to the place were most strongly in favour of the project. So it is not inevitable, and it depends, I think, on how the project is interpreted. So you come back then to the meanings to some degree about whether you think that the project is a good fit or the project is not a good fit with the place or the environment. But also, I think one of the reasons why you have so many different results in these studies is because they are not really using the method appropriately. There is a confusion over how to do the research and what kind of questions to put in the surveys, etc. But what we tried to do in this research was to say that actually there are many different ways of relating to a place, and these might have an influence on social acceptance. So in these studies, including my own, typically the research investigates place attachment in a single dimension. So you characterize your sample of participants as being very strongly attached to the place or very weakly attached to the place, and it is a single dimension. But there is research in the literature in environmental psychology and community sociology that tries to make it more complicated as having different kinds of relationships. So this table here is quite a useful one to see because it says that there are actually 5 different kinds of relationship with a place. The first 2 are both strong, and the second 3 are all weak or absent relationships with the place. So the first 2 are described as traditional and active, and the traditional one is taken for granted. It is not something that is very much thought about, and it typically comes from dwelling in a location for a long period of time, maybe even beyond one generation of a family, etc. The active attachment is more self-conscious, and it is also involving involvement in many activities in the place. And there is work in sociology where they talk about elective belonging, which is quite similar to active attachment. And it reflects ways in which people who are more mobile can move into a place from other places because they like the environment, they like the amenities, and they choose to base themselves there because they think there is a good fit between themselves and the place that they live in. So there are different kinds of strong attachment bonds, but there are also many types of weak bonds. So place relativity describes somebody who quite likes the area they live, but if they had to move somewhere next week, it would not be a big crisis for them. So they have a relativity towards that place. We have people who are alienated, who really do not like where they are. They have an estrangement from that place for various kinds of reasons. And then there is the final type, which is described as placelessness, which is a kind of indifference. The place is not important for your way of living. Maybe relationships with other people are important, or your job is important, but the place is not really important for you. And this is associated in the literature with high levels of mobility. So people who do not come to think that it is important for them to have roots in a location at all. So this is research which has been done before, not so many studies, but not yet applied to the issue of how do you understand the responses of communities to new energy infrastructure. So that is what we tried to do in this piece of research. The idea was to explore how these 5 varieties relate to people's responses, again to a power line linked to that project. And we also wanted to understand the causes of these different ways of relating to the place you now live in. Where does it come from? Is it something to do with your biography, your history, your past experience? This data comes from in-depth interviews conducted with the residents of a town which was in the second case study area in southwest England, and we used a narrative analytic approach. So we were not interested in themes so much as the way in which people constructed a story of their lives across time, of the different places that they have lived in, and how they feel or not about those places, how important they are or not for their identity or for their sense of who they are. So this particular town is in the second case study area in the southwest of England. The town is called Nailsea, and it has about 15,000 inhabitants, so it's pretty small. It used to be a small village surrounded by countryside. Now it's a town. And the important thing to say about this place is that it is about 15 kilometers from a larger city called Bristol. And it also has it already has a power line on the west side, which has been there for maybe 30 years, which is quite a small line. And these new proposals were to build a much bigger line across this area beside the town to construct a new nuclear power station. From the beginning, there was local opposition. There was an active group called Nailsea Against Pylons. They tried to show the impact of the transmission pylons by putting images into the local countryside, showing that they would be higher than the oak trees in the fields, and so they would reinforce the sense that the scale is not appropriate, and they would destroy the character of the environment. So what we did in this study was to ask people about their residential history and biographies, and we chose 25 people who were diversity of length of residence and gender and age and social class. So we tried to have a mixture of people taking part. And we found 5 what we call trajectories of the places that people live across their lives. We found some people who had only ever lived in this town. They had never lived anywhere else. We found some people who had grown up in this place, but who had left to go to university or to go to college or to get a job. They had spent maybe 2 or 3 years away. The experience was not pleasant. They had not enjoyed it, and they had returned back to the childhood place which they regard as home, and they were intending to stay. They were not going anywhere else. The third trajectory we identified was people who moved into the place as an adult from a similar kind of place. We say semi-rural, not too large, nearby countryside. So we find people like that. And then we find people who moved into the town as an adult from a very different kind of settlement, maybe a very big city or a larger town. And finally, we find people who have very high levels of mobility, who, if you ask them about how many houses they've lived in, they talk about 10 or 15 or 20 different places of living across their lifetime, across the years. So we do find a heterogeneity in patterns of residence across the lifetime. And then we investigated how people felt about the new proposals for the power line across these different categories. But just to say one thing is that there is some literature in environmental psychology on the concept of identity connected to settlement type. And this suggests that over their lives, people come to see themselves as a kind of person who lives in a kind of settlement. So maybe if you like living in a big city, you come to see yourself as a city person. Or if you like living in the countryside, you come to see yourself as a country kind of person or a village kind of person. And what we found is that to some degree, when you mix the settlement identities across people's residential biography, then you lead to different patterns of connection to the current place. So the people who move from similar kind of places feel a stronger connection to the current place they live in because it's similar to the places they've already lived. But if it's very different, then those are the people who are more likely to feel place relativity or even alienation because the character of the local place is not what they are used to and not what they appreciate either. So that's maybe something as part of this story. So this table describes the first 3 of those trajectories on the left-hand side. And in the middle, we have the kind of variety of attachment that I mentioned. And on the right-hand side, we have their level of acceptability or their position around the proposals for the power line. So what we find is that the first 2 kinds of people whose childhood was in this place, who either always lived there or moved back to that place, these people, when they talk about the place that they live in now, they talk about it as if they are traditionally attached. So it's not something they think about very much. It's in the background. It's normal. It's not something to discuss, it's just taken for granted. For these people, they describe power lines as being normal, familiar, because they have memories of playing in the country area, of seeing the pylons every day. The smaller power line, they did not regard it as being out of place because they saw it as being already a character of the local area, and so they thought, no problem. They were not typically against it in terms of their perspective. But we found people who had moved back into the place, who had not lived there as children, but who had moved from similar kind of semi-rural places, and who had consciously moved to Nailsea because they valued its size and its proximity to the countryside. These people were the people who talked about the essentialisation of the difference between the countryside and the power line. They described themselves as actively involved in the place, keeping up with change, and really feeling very strongly connected, even though they had not lived in the place for very long. And they were the people who found it most difficult to imagine putting this there and feeling very emotionally distressed at the idea. Here are some illustrative quotations from the interviews describing the familiarity, the normality of infrastructure in the countryside of this kind. It is not going to have a huge impact. And then we have other people who are also very strongly attached, who feel that it will have an enormous impact and it will be very destructive and it will spoil the countryside. It is out of character, it is not expected, it is out of proportion, etc. It's industrial. So this is one of the reasons why one of our conclusions is that you cannot take strong place attachment alone as telling you enough about understanding people's responses, because both Rachel here, which is a pseudonym, and Gabby, they are both strongly attached to the place, but they have different kinds of ways of relating to the place, and it leads to different kinds of responses to change. And then if we have the other kinds of trajectories of people who move to Nailsea as adults from a different kind of place, or people who move to Nailsea as adults with very high mobility, we also see that these people are opposed. It is not the case that these people are thinking, I do not really care about Nailsea, so I don't mind if the power line is proposed. They were also objecting to it, but they objected on different grounds. They did not complain about its impact on the town or its impact on the countryside, but they did talk about distributional justice and they did talk about procedural justice. So they had different arguments, but they were not about the local place. The other thing to say about the final one, which I think is interesting, is that at least one of these individuals who we described as having a placelessness relationship had been living in Nailsea for 10 years. So it is not the case that this person lives for 6 months and then moves somewhere else, lives for 6 months, then moves somewhere else. One of these people had lived there for a decade, so longer than some of the people who felt very strongly attached to the place. But when you asked this person, you know, why do you like living here? Why do you choose to live here? The discourse was about the fact that Nailsea was near the motorway, it's near the train station. It is easy to go other places. It's easy to leave because of the infrastructure. It is convenient for traveling. So the characteristics of the local area that are positively valued are completely different from the characteristics of the local area that are valued by people who are strongly attached to the place. And here are some quotations just to bear that out. So people talked about the problems with the consultation process. It's a fait accompli. The decision has already been taken. It's just a charade. And then also about distributional justice. This area is not going to benefit from the place. It's just about the grid as a whole, etc. It's a problem with the distribution of the costs and the benefits to some degree. So the last thing I wanted to say before finishing is that there is something interesting in this case about the visibility or the invisibility of the technology. Normally in the literature, it is assumed that people object to wind farms because they will change the visual character of the countryside and it will make it visually unappealing. So the visual aspect is very, very important. If you look at the two kinds of strong place attachment, they have different levels of invisibility of the power lines. So the existing power line is pretty invisible to the traditionally attached people because it is so familiar to them that they do not even notice it anymore. It's just normal. And if it is very similar in some ways to studies done in the UK of people living beside a nuclear power station. Again, we have research which says that it is such a normal part of the backdrop, maybe for other reasons too, but they do not really see it as something that they notice on a day-to-day basis. But for the people who had moved into the area, who are described as actively attached, the existing power line is also invisible. But it's invisible because they want to see the countryside as being this pristine, natural area. And then the new power line will change this. So they they do not see the industrialization that may be already there, because it is not compatible with their view of the area. And so both of these see the industry in different ways, and both of them are strongly attached to the place. So the previous studies, which were only interested in the difference between strong attachment and weak attachment, do not find these differences. So to finish this bit, just to say that the way in which people feel attached to the place they now live is at least some degree explained by their residential histories. And there are different ways of relating to where you currently live, and there is a whole variety of those which are important to consider when you investigate contexts of change. What the study does is it connects the biography with the place meanings, with place attachments, with social acceptance in a way that studies have not really done very well before. They have looked on some of those, but not all together. And they also show that there are many reasons to be opposed, and it depends on, to some degree, the kind of relationship you have with the place. So maybe for the first time it shows that the different explanations for conflict to do with procedural justice and distributional justice are also connected with place attachment, but depending on the strength or weakness of that and how it plays out. So just to finish, I think the research shows that at least some of the explanation for social conflict around the siting of these kinds of infrastructures is to do with the way in which the meanings are constructed about the places and the changes, and also about the relationships with the places that people have and the variety of kinds of relationships that people have. And just to say that one of the things that I have been researching recently and at the moment is to say that actually one of the problems with this approach is the fact that it only looks at social acceptability in terms of the local place and the local attachment bonds. But these infrastructures are not just local. They are maybe nationally significant, even internationally significant. So in a study that I have been working on, we have been trying to see whether people who have maybe strong national affiliation or identity or belonging, or even global, and how they also respond to these kind of technologies, and looking for differences there. So I think that's something that research in the future needs to do a bit better than we have been doing in the past. The second thing is to look at these other issues of trust and justice. These are important here because they also turn up when people have not got a strong attachment to place. But even when people are strongly attached, to me there is always a spatial dimension to procedural justice, and there is a spatiality to distributional justice. But I think the research has not yet enough looked at the connection between place attachment and these different justice discourses, because to me it seems evident that if you think that all of the benefits go somewhere else and none of the benefits go to the local area, that argument might be felt more by someone who is strongly attached to the local place, maybe. So that is something to think about maybe for future research. Thank you. That's me finished. Thank you for your attention. And yeah, there's some studies there, but I guess you know what they are already.
So I'm sure there will be many comments, questions, topics for discussion about these presentations. So who would you like to start?
Thank you for this very interesting presentation. I would like to ask you the temporality of this attachment that you're studying, because I used to work in the Reunion Island, where it's not about nature versus industry, but it's about nature versus agricultural and forestry implantation. And they planted this big cryptomeria plantation, and when they started it, everybody was against it because they said it completely disturbed the landscape. It's not our nature. It's not our place. And 20 years later, potentially the same people actually claim that area and that settlement to that particular part of the landscape to be their own, to be the identity of the place. So I'm not sure it was studied to actually, I'm not fully sure that these are the same people who are saying, who were opposing and 20 years later defending the place, this element of the landscape. But I'm wondering whether the different type of attachment that you suggested could be more durable or actually plastic.
Yeah. Okay. So your question is about the temporality of place attachment rather than the temporality of social acceptance, or is it about both of those things?
I guess if we are using one to explain the other.
Sure. Yeah. Well, the first thing to say is that research of this kind is limited in how much it can tell you because it is only done at one time point. So the literature generally doesn't help you an awful lot in understanding processes of change because you need maybe longitudinal research, and that's more difficult to do. But nevertheless, in the social acceptability literature, there has been an idea around for 10 or 15 years that you have a graph which is like a U or a V. So at the beginning, initially anyway, there is a lot of hostility towards the technology, and then after time, people become more accustomed to it and they accept it, which is a little bit like what you suggested. That idea has been around for quite a while in the literature, but there have not been very many longitudinal studies to provide empirical support for that idea. And I have always been a little bit skeptical that, that you can make this assumption, because I think that from my point of view, the absence of objection is not the same as support. So what you see clearly is that people object at a certain time, and then the building happens and there's no more objection. But that's not the same thing as people necessarily changing their minds. Maybe they do, but you cannot necessarily assume that. But we also know that place meanings are not fixed, so they do change over time. And so it is not surprising maybe that the idea of what the place is like will be different from 2 decades in the past or 2 decades in the future, because places are always changing. Human geographers talk about that a lot, that you do not want to have a static idea about a place or a place meaning. So if you take that into account, then maybe it is quite likely that these things will be different in the future, but in what way is less than fully clear. And we already have lots of examples, I think, in the countryside where you have windmills which are historic and they are considered to be pretty and part of the history of the area. But if people want to build a wind turbine, there's lots of objection, and it's the same technology, it's just a different form. So there is plenty of evidence, I think, that these things do change, and that is likely to be the case. So maybe that answers your question a little bit, I don't know.
I was just wondering whether
Yeah.
the attachment, the different types of
Yes.
attachments, maybe some are more labile than others.
Yes, I mean,
but maybe it's too early to you never had the chance to do 2 studies.
sure. Yeah. I mean, I think it's a really nice question, and of course, the general sociology is that the traditional attachment is dying out because society becomes more mobile. The traditionally attached people have very, very low levels of mobility. So maybe there is a general shift down the varieties, which does not mean that people are not locally attached anymore, but maybe the traditional attachment, which comes from living in the same place for your whole life, is maybe less and less common. At least that's something that you read about when you read sociology, Anthony Giddens, etc. But I mean, to me, one of the interesting things here is about social science and academics. Academics tend to be quite mobile, and so the literature about residence and mobility is really, sometimes it's quite hostile about local identity. If you read human geography, they talk about parochialism versus cosmopolitanism. And so I think some of the assumptions in the literature about place attachment are stemming from maybe some of the characteristics of the writers, which are not necessarily very, very useful either. So maybe parochialism sometimes is quite a good thing. But yeah, generally I think maybe there is not much evidence, but we are likely to see more active attachment and more place relativity and maybe more placelessness and less traditional attachment if society keeps moving in the direction that it seems to be going of more levels of mobility.
Thank you. Bernard and then Olivier.
My question is about the last category and and maybe also another one. Are their position really grounded on the issue of place and what is happening on a location, or may not be because their way of living and the mobility and probably things like that? They have also opinions about nuclear power or pylons and lines, more dealing with a general view and criticism of energy and of the carbon system or things like that at the national or global level. And they are against nuclear power, and of course they are against the pylons here because it's linked to or things like that. So is it relevant to ask to these people and to interpret the answer in terms of links to location and to the place or things like that, and maybe it's something else?
Yeah, I think your question is right in the sense that it is maybe too narrow a focus only to think about the local place part of this story. But we asked people, if the power line was transporting renewable energy, would you be more likely to support it? And they said no. So we had at least some feeling that it was not anti-nuclear sentiment that was leading to anti-power line objections. It was the fact that they regarded the power line itself as being inappropriate for that context. Yeah, I mean, I think views about the national system and how energy is produced is related, but in this study here, and I mean, what we did in this study, because it is a qualitative method, we aren't able to say relatively how important is the place element in comparison to other issues with procedural justice or distributional justice. But if you look at some of the quantitative studies where they compare the relative importance of place attachment and other project-related things about trust and distributional justice issues and impacts, etc., they do come out as being very strong, if not more important, in those kind of quantitative analyses. So, you know, I accept that. Here we had a particular purpose, which was to see how these arguments are done. But the relative strength will vary, and they may not be the most important one. And the other thing to say is that when people are making an objection, maybe they will use whichever arguments they think will work in that context that will be successful. So again, you cannot make too many assumptions that this explanation is more important than that one, because it is a strategic response in that context anyway.
The answer to your question.
Yes. Yeah.
So, nice people.
Thank you. Olivier?
Thanks a lot for your talk. It was very, very interesting to me how you can explain these different positions regarding infrastructures, and we meet the same ones for water-related infrastructure like dams, same kind of oppositions. And we had this kind of issues recently in France also. What I wonder from this explanation, how people feel about these new pylons, this new dam or whatever, or this new airport. How can we build on this to find out some legitimacy to these people in public debates, in bringing their voice in the decision making? Because in UK as in France, we are compelled to go towards more participations, toward more involvement of people on the ground, but they are quite often disqualified as soon as they come with this kind of arguments like disruption to place or lack of trust you mentioned, and they are disqualified in the public debates. And do you have any ideas, any suggestions how to put them in?
I guess I have thought about this a little bit. I think maybe it's useful to go back to this slide again. I think there is a big challenge in involving these people in the consultation exercises. There's much less difficulty with these. They keep up with change. If there is a meeting, they will go. For these people, I think, I suppose the best answer I can give you at this stage is about a different project I'm involved in, which is about community mapping. And that project is about a process where people come together to celebrate their local place and to sketch it and make a painting or a tapestry which describes all the things they like about that area. And when we look at that process, it involves both of these kinds of people. Maybe sometimes these are the instigators, but it involves a dialogue between all the people who have lived in the place for a long time, and it gives an opportunity for people to talk about their stories of what the place was like in history, and what are the experiences, what are the memories, what are the important places in the local area where things have happened in the past. So I suppose my answer to you is that if the development process was more sensitive to the local character, and it began with the local character maybe before it talked about the infrastructure, then maybe you have an opportunity to involve these people in conversations that you would not if you began with the energy project. So you have to be able to have a different kind of dialogue, which maybe starts with the place and then moves outwards or moves forward into the future, rather than starts with the future change and then goes into the environment and then tries to talk about it. And if you do that, then maybe you have a better chance of reaching these kind of individuals, because you then give them a value. What we find in the UK, at least in these disputes, is that the companies who are doing consultation are not really interested in these people, because they're not really interested in the place. They just want to get the technology built as quickly as possible and then go on somewhere else and do it. So I have been trying to encourage them to take a more place-sensitive perspective, which means starting from the locality and then thinking outwards from there or into the future. There are lots of reasons why they would not want to do this, I think, but maybe it is a way of having less conflict, but it's also maybe a way of involving these people in a better way than you get at the moment, possibly. But it will be difficult. I think the problem is that consultation is an activity that takes time and money. So there are lots of reasons why companies, or even governments, would regard it as being something that's not very important. So but that depends on how we want to do the transition and whether we want acceptance or support or tolerance or whatever. So.
I was wondering, I know you are from a psychological, you have a psychological background, but have you tried to find out if behind this type of relation with places, you had social characteristics? I mean, people who are more in a traditional attachment, do they have all common social characteristics or sociological characteristics?
Yes, they do, yes. I mean, in the sense that, and I suppose maybe I need to make this more clear, when they are attached to the place, they are attached to the people in the place, the people who are there now, the people who were there before. So for these people, a lot of their family will live nearby, their previous generations will live nearby, so there is a very strong interconnection between the local society and the environment that they feel connected to. They're not separate in that sense. So yes, that's the reason. And that's also some of the reasons why people move to these places later in life as well. If we found, for example, that some of the people who were relative or even alienated, they were there because of their social relationships. So they had moved because maybe if you're in a, if I'm a man and my wife has a baby and she wants to live near the grandparents, then you move close to that place for that reason, but you personally do not value that environment. You're only there because your partner wants to live there for a certain reason, or your employment is something. So the other things are very important in shaping mobility, which lead to these feelings of less strong attachment. Now, maybe they change over time, but when we were talking to them, the social relationships were often very important in being the cause, but also some of the weakness of the attachment bond as well.
Thank you for your very interesting presentation. I was wondering if you are developing some relations with sociologists or in sociology or social anthropology. Because, for example, in sociology in France, we have such sociologists who are looking at this question of place-based attachment to deal with the incommensurability of some environmental or land damages, especially when people are distributed in their environment, which is frequently the case, for example, of what you call traditional attachment. But I know also that in the UK, well, I mean, at least in France, we frequently look at or use the work of Tim Ingold and the concept of dueling to the place, which is a very deep concept. So I was wondering if you tried to associate or develop also or elaborate on this type of works.
Yes. Not really, I think. I mean, I'm aware of Ingold's work a little bit, but I have not had the opportunity to, I think, fully understand it. I think I've heard that it is quite different from other ways of thinking about relationships with place. Doesn't he talk about lines, I think?
Yes.
Yes, so it's, maybe there's more mobility in his assumptions, perhaps. But it's not something I'm very expert in, I think, I'm afraid. But yeah, I would be interested to know more. I mean, how do you think it connects? Do you have any ideas about how Ingold relates to these different types? Do you have some ideas on that?
I'm not specialist of
Okay.
Tim Ingold. I know more from
the French
French pragmatic sociology.
Yes.
But Tim Ingold, I don't know if in the play, if in the room somebody knows.
Sure.
I'm not, but
Yeah. But you talk about the incommensurability
yeah,
in this sociology,
yeah.
and that's what is incommensurate? Is it between the environment and the change, or the technology, or the industry? Is it?
It deals with some damages which are invisible for people who are not living, who are not attached to the place, for people who are not distributed in the environment. So I can send you some works I read about this. There are works, for example, about the Seveso case from Laura Centemary. Laura Centemary. She works on the Seveso cases. Yeah. Yeah.
No, I don't know. So this was a controversial project, yeah.
It's a big accident in Seveso in Italy.
Okay. Okay. All right, thank you.